And in general, don't see the past as a life sentence. The situation is never going to be exactly the same. History doesn't repeat, history rhymes. We tend to worry a lot about things that probably will never happen. So since most of the things that we think may happen, that we fear may happen, never actually occur, how can we stop worrying so we can start living? So the first tip would be to try and do it the opposite way around. To try to stop worrying by starting to live. To immerse ourselves in an activity that we find so enjoyable that we forget everything else around us. And this state is called flow. Now the reason why this state makes us worry less is that during flow there's a state of hypofrontality, which basically means that the prefrontal cortex, this brain region up here, that is there for decision making, is kind of shut down. The brain activity during these states in the prefrontal cortex is very low. By the way, that is the reason why back in the day they did lobotomies, which of course you shouldn't do because the prefrontal cortex is extremely important for future planning. But the reason why they did lobotomies back in the days when they didn't know how important the prefrontal cortex was is because they noticed that without the prefrontal cortex, people would feel less depressed and less anxious. And that is exactly because the prefrontal cortex, it predicts things about the future, also negative things, and that's why it's good for planning. However, the downside of that is that we think too much about the future and what might happen that we're afraid of. Now, as funny as this sounds, when you're in flow, you are so immersed in the activity. When you have no time to ruminate, then you don't have any time to ruminate. So basically what I'm saying is that when you're in flow, when you're working at something that you really enjoy, you simply don't have the time to think about it. You're too distracted from all the anxiety that there's no way you can think about the fears that you have. Flow is in general the state in which we're fully present. And then the second tip would be to realise that no matter how much you think about the past, the future isn't going to simply change because you worry about it. Now, of course you want to make plans for the future, but when you're not making plans about how you can handle what may come in the future, simply thinking about what makes you afraid without trying to solve the problem is unnecessary and just a waste of time and a waste of your energy. And when it comes to planning your future and also planning around the things that you may be afraid of, there's the danger that you might get into the state of paralysis analysis, where you're simply caught up in making so many decisions that there's no way of actually dealing with the situation in a constructive way because you're too much in your head. And in general, don't see the past as a life sentence. It's not a life sentence, it's a lesson. There's also no point about thinking about the past too much, because the situation is never going to be exactly the same. History doesn't repeat, history rhymes. So don't think about what you would have, what you should have, what you could have done. Instead, think about what you would do, what you will do in a similar situation in the future. And then the third tip would be Tim Ferriss's method of fear setting. So instead of goal setting, what Tim Ferriss does is he writes down, well, all his goals, but then, and this is the most important part of this exercise, he will write down what he fears may happen if his goals go wrong, if everything goes entirely wrong due to his goals. And then what he'll do, which is the most important bit, is he'll, in another column, he will write down what he's going to do in case that worst case scenario happens. Because if you're anxious, it's no good to simply stop at the bit where you write down all your fears. If you do that, then of course you're going to be even more anxious. However, the point of this exercise isn't to make you even more anxious, it's to make you less anxious because you know what you're going to do in case that happens, so that you can be optimistic through being pessimistic. So what I mean by that is that by being pessimistic about what may happen, you can be optimistic about the fact that if it does happen, you will be able to actually handle the situation because you've thought of it beforehand, because you know exactly what you're going to do. And also, the reason why you want to confront yourself with these worst case scenarios is that once something is familiar to you, which is why we like to stay in our comfort zones a lot. And mostly, I think what we're mostly afraid of isn't necessarily, well, of course, for a big part, it's also what may happen. But I think it may also be even more difficult, even more scary, because of the uncertainty around how we should be dealing with that problem and what it would be like. So if you think about that, you will feel less anxious. If we're uncertain about something, we will think about it even longer. So for example, if we watch a movie in which we don't know what actually happens with the main character in the end, we will think about that movie for way longer. And with happy films, we will also be happier for way longer if we don't know what actually happens to the main character. On Tom Bilyeu's podcast, someone correctly pointed out that once you say something aloud, it doesn't have any power over you anymore. And Kobe Bryant also thinks the same thing. That's how he also handled his fear of failure. And then the fourth tip would be a breathing technique against anxiety by Stanford neuroscientist Andrew Huberman. So a great way of dealing with anxiety would be the physiological SIGH, which would be 2 short inhales and 1 long exhale. The reason why you want to do that is that when you do that, your blood tends to flow more quickly, and then your body will send a signal to the brain to slow down your heart rate because blood is flowing so quickly, and therefore your heart rate will slow down. Whereas if you do the opposite, if you take a long inhale and only a short exhale, you will actually feel more anxious. So the worst thing you can tell someone, ironically, when they're anxious is to take a deep breath because inhaling very deeply actually makes you more alert and therefore makes you more anxious. And the 5th tip would be self-talk. If you want to worry less, then you definitely want to somehow improve your self-talk. If you want to know how to improve your self-talk, you can watch this video here.